All right, let's dive in today and untangle how power is split up in the U.S. system. We're talking federal, state, and local governments.
Always a fun run.
You know it. We're zeroing in on two biggies, federal preemption and the Dormant Commerce Clause.
Ah, yes. Classic constitutional law.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll get how these ideas shape the laws we live with every day.
And you might even start spotting them in action all around you.
Plus, we've got a real head-scratcher of a case later on about radioactive waste.
Oh,
It'll make you think twice about what you throw away.
I'm intrigued already.
Okay, first up, federal preemption. Basically, when a federal law and a state law disagree, the feds win.
Right. It all goes back to the supremacy clause in the Constitution. Federal law is top dog.
But it's not always a clean sweep, right?
Hey.
Our sources say there are actually three kinds of preemption.
Yeah, it can get kind of nuanced. Let's break them down. The simplest one is express preemption. Congress straight up says, states, back off. This is our turf.
So, like, if the feds set air quality standards, states can't go lower.
Exactly. Then there's conflict preemption. That's when state and federal laws clash head-on. You can't follow both.
Like a federal minimum wage law, and a state tries to set a lower one.
Bingo! Those two just can't exist together. The courts would step in and toss out the state law.
Makes sense. And the last type.
Field preemption. Here, Congress basically says, this whole area is ours. Hands off states. Think airline safety or, as you mentioned, nuclear energy.
So states can't just make their own rules in those areas.
So, they're preempted. Now, to see this in action, let's look at Silkwood v. Kerr-McGee Court.
Yeah, that case from our research. Tragic story. A worker exposed to radiation. Her father sued the company.
And at first glance, you might think, well, nuclear stuff, that's got to be federal territory, right?
Total field preemption. Case closed.
But the Supreme Court surprised everyone. They said, hold on, state law isn't totally kicked out here.
Really?
They said states can still have a say in things like worker safety and compensation, even in a heavily regulated field like nuclear energy.
So even with the feds in charge, there's wiggle room for state laws.
Exactly. Silkwood shows that preemption isn't always black and white. Sometimes those laws can work together.
Okay, so that's federal preemption, the big kahuna. Now, onto this mysterious Dormant Commerce Clause. What's so sleepy about it?
The name's a bit misleading. What it means is that even when Congress hasn't made a specific law about interstate commerce, there are still limits on what states can do.
So states can't just throw up their own trade barriers, even if the feds are quiet on the issue.
You got it. It's all about keeping a unified national market. Imagine the mess if every state had its own crazy rules about goods crossing borders.
Yeah, talk about a logistical nightmare. Prices would skyrocket. So how do courts decide if a state law has gone too far?
They use two main tests, the discrimination test and the excessive burden test. The first one checks if a state law is playing favorites, giving an advantage to in-state businesses over those from out of state.
Can't have that. Nope. Take Dean Milk Co. v. City of Madison, a classic case. Wisconsin said all milk sold in Madison had to be processed nearby. Seems reasonable, right?
Sure, local sourcing and all, but I bet there's a catch.
Of course. It basically shut out milk producers from other states, even if they were just a little further away. The Supreme Court said, nope, that's discrimination, not cool.
So the Dormant Commerce Clause stops states from playing those protectionist games.
Exactly. Now, the excessive burden test, this one's subtler. It kicks in even when a state law isn't openly favoring local businesses.
So even a well-intentioned law could be a problem.
Yep. If it throws a huge wrench in the gears of interstate commerce, it's out of here.
Think about Southern Pacific v. Arizona. Arizona limited train lengths for safety seemed reasonable enough.
Shorter trains, less risk.
On the surface, yeah. But the Supreme Court saw that it would force railroads to either make their trains tiny or break them up at the Arizona border. Massive delays, huge costs.
So the burden on nationwide commerce outweighed Arizona's safety concerns.
Right. The court basically said, nice try, Arizona, but this is too much of a headache for everyone else.
Makes you realize how carefully the courts have to balance things. So are there any times when states can favor their own?
There are a couple of exceptions. One is the market participant exception. If a state's acting like a regular business, not a regulator, they've got some leeway. Like selling timber from state-owned land, they can give priority to in-state buyers.
So it's like if you're having a yard sale, you get to choose who to sell to.
Exactly. And the other exception is congressional consent. If Congress gives a state the thumbs up to do something that would normally violate the Dormant Commerce Clause, then it's all good.
So Congress can give states a free pass if they see fit.
You got it. It's all about finding that sweet spot where states keep some power but don't mess up the national system.
And speaking of real-world examples, remember that garbage case we mentioned?
Oh, yeah, the one that stinks. I'm ready for it.
Let's dump it out on the table. Welcome back, Deep Divers. Last time, we waded through federal preemption and the Dormant Commerce Clause.
Those are the heavy hitters in the world of how power is divided in the U.S. system.
And we saw how they play out in some pretty wild real-life cases. But now I want to get even more down to earth. How about some examples of state and local power that we bump into every day?
Sounds good. Let's start with something I bet you use constantly, your phone.
Oh yeah, can't live without it. But what do phones have to do with state and local governments?
Think about all those taxes and fees on your phone bill. You know, those extra charges that make you go, what?
Don't remind me. Half my bill is just mystery fees.
Well, some of those are probably state and local taxes. States can tax businesses that operate within their borders, and that includes those big telecom companies.
So that's why my friends in other states sometimes complain about their phone bills being way higher than mine.
Makes sense. Each state sets its own rate, so there's a lot of variation.
But wouldn't that patchwork of taxes be a nightmare for companies that do business nationwide?
Oh, it definitely creates headaches for them. There have been attempts to smooth things out at the federal level, but states really like their taxing power. They don't want to give it up.
So my phone bill is like a mini course in federalism.
You got it. And it's not just about taxes. States also get to regulate things like cell tower placement and laying fiber optic cables.
That's why there's always debate in my town about where to put new cell towers.
Exactly. States and local governments have to balance everyone's interests. Those who want better service, those worried about how it looks, and even folks concerned about potential health effects.
Wow, so many layers of government just to make a phone call.
It's more complicated than you think. Okay, what's another everyday example? How about education?
Oh yeah, that's huge. We all know there's the Federal Department of Education, but I remember learning that most of the big decisions about schools happen at the state and local level.
Right. The U.S. education system is super decentralized. The feds give some money and set some broad goals, but states have a ton of control. How they spend money, what kids learn, even stuff like school calendars and teacher qualifications.
I remember being so confused when I moved to a new state and the school year started a whole month later than I was used to. But why is it set up like this? Why not just have one national system?
That's a great question. It goes back to the whole idea of federalism. The idea is that communities know best what their kids need. They should be the ones calling the shots.
So it's all about local control, making sure schools fit the community.
Exactly. And this can lead to some really cool stuff. Different states and school districts can try new things, experiment with different ways of teaching. They can adapt what kids learn to fit the local culture and economy.
I can see how that would be a good thing. But what about when some communities have way more money than others? Or when states just have different ideas about what's important in education? That seems like it could create problems.
That's the downside for sure. Decentralization can lead to unequal opportunities for kids. And that's where you see a lot of legal battles. People arguing that the way states fund schools or draw district lines isn't fair.
So it's a constant struggle to balance local control with making sure all kids get a fair shot.
It is, yeah. Federalism has its pros and cons. Okay, phones, education. What else touches our lives every day? How about healthcare?
Oh, man, that's a big one. Especially these days with all the debates about the Affordable Care Act and what role states should play.
Right. Healthcare in the U.S. is a giant mix of federal and state responsibilities. You've got federal programs like Medicare and Medicaid that provide insurance for tons of people, but states have a lot of say in how those programs actually work on the ground.
And then there's all the other stuff states do, like running their own insurance marketplaces, setting rules for doctors and hospitals, and doing public health stuff. It's a maze.
It really is. And remember the Dormant Commerce Clause we talked about earlier? How it stops states from messing with interstate commerce? Well, healthcare isn't just a local thing anymore.
I'm starting to get it. People travel to different states for medical care. Telehealth connects patients and doctors across the country. Drug companies operate globally.
Exactly. Healthcare is national and even international now. So any state law that tries to limit how healthcare services or products move around could run into trouble with the Dormant Commerce Clause.
So if a state tried to, say, stop doctors from other states offering telehealth services, or make it hard to get certain medications from out of state, that could be a problem.
You got it. Those kinds of laws have faced legal challenges. It's fascinating how these principles we talked about affect something as important as healthcare.
This is really making me think about all the ways we're connected, even across state lines. Okay, we've got phones, education, healthcare. What else should we add to our list?
Let's not forget about the environment. This is another arena where the feds, states, and local governments are constantly figuring out who's in charge.
Oh, yeah, huge topic. Climate change, pollution, waste.
The feds set some overall standards through the EPA, but states and local governments do most of the actual work to implement and enforce those standards.
And that's where things get interesting, right? Different states have different priorities, different resources, and sometimes they even disagree with federal policies.
Totally. You might have one state that's super focused on fighting climate change, setting ambitious goals for renewable energy and cutting emissions, but then another state might be all about creating jobs, even if it means being less strict on environmental rules.
That's a big difference. And wouldn't those different state policies cause problems when it comes to things like air and water pollution, which don't just stop at state borders?
You're right, it creates challenges. Air pollution can drift from one state to another, and rivers and streams carry pollution downstream, affecting people far away from where it started.
So how do we balance the idea of local control with the fact that environmental problems often cross state lines?
That's the million-dollar question. Sometimes the federal government steps in and sets national standards, especially when it's clear that pollution is affecting multiple states.
And I bet the Dormant Commerce Clause comes into play here too. If a state tries to set environmental standards that mess with trade, that could be a no-no.
Exactly. There have been cases where states tried to ban certain goods or materials from other states because of environmental concerns, but the court said, nope, that's interfering with interstate commerce.
So even when it comes to something as vital as protecting the environment, it's a constant back and forth between what states want to do and what's allowed under the Constitution.
It is, for sure. And this tension is only going to get more intense as we deal with bigger environmental challenges in the future. Climate change, especially, makes us think differently about how we manage resources and regulate industries, because the impacts don't care about state borders.
This deep dive is really eye-opening. It's amazing to see how all these pieces fit together. Okay, so we've covered phones, education, healthcare, the environment, all things we experience every day that are shaped by this balance of power between the feds, states, and local governments.
And we've seen how legal principles like federal preemption and the Dormant Commerce Clause play a big role in how these things work.
It's been quite a journey. But before we wrap up this part, what are the main takeaways you hope our listeners will remember?
I hope they come away realizing that power in the U.S. isn't just about what happens in Washington. States and local governments have a huge impact on our lives, often in ways we don't even think about.
Yeah, that's a good point. From the taxes we pay to the schools our kids go to the air we breathe, so much is decided at the state and local level.
Totally. And I also hope they understand that this system of shared power, called federalism, has both good and bad sides. There's this constant tug of war between wanting local control and needing things to be consistent across the country.
It's a balancing act, and there's no perfect solution. But understanding these principles, like federal preemption and the Dormant Commerce Clause, helps us make sense of it all.
Exactly. It gives us the tools to understand the news, participate in our communities, and make our voices heard.
So it's not just about learning legal stuff. It's about being active citizens.
Absolutely. And while we focused on the limits on states and local governments, it's important to remember that they can do amazing things too.
Oh, yeah. Let's not forget that. We've talked about the constraints, but what about the opportunities?
States are often called laboratories of democracy. They can try new things, experiment with policies, and come up with solutions that work for their specific communities.
So even though we have this national framework, states still have a lot of freedom to be creative and respond to what their citizens need.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so exciting. When states take the lead on issues like climate change, healthcare, or criminal justice reform, they can inspire other states to follow suit. They can even influence national policy.
So it's not just about reacting to what the feds say. It's about setting the agenda and pushing for progress.
That's the spirit. And here's a final thought for our listeners to chew on. In a world that's increasingly connected by technology, globalization, and problems that cross borders, how do we rethink this balance of power for the 21st century?
That's a big one. Are we talking about things like cybersecurity, data privacy, artificial intelligence? All these issues that don't fit neatly into our traditional ideas of state and federal authority.
You nailed it. These new challenges are forcing us to ask tough questions about federalism and how to govern effectively in a complex world.
It's like our whole conversation about state and local power is now happening on a global scale.
It is. And there are no easy answers. We need to think carefully, talk openly, and be ready to change our systems to meet these new challenges.
That's a great note to end on. A call to action for our listeners to stay curious, engaged, and involved in shaping the future of our democracy.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, deep divers, we're going to take a quick breather and gather our thoughts. When we come back for our final part, we'll wrap up our exploration of state and local power with some concluding insights and a challenge for you to take all this knowledge out into the world. Stick with us. Welcome back, deep divers. We've been knee-deep in the world of state and local power.
From federal preemption all the way down to how that dormant commerce clause plays out in real life.
We've seen it all. Garbage battles, cantaloupe confusion. But before we wrap this whole thing up, I got to ask, so what? Why should our listeners care about these legal twists and turns?
That's a good question. It can seem kind of dry, right? All these laws and court cases. But they really do affect us. Understanding how power works, how the feds and the states tussle over it, helps you make sense of the news and the decisions happening right where you live.
It's like peeking behind the curtain and seeing how the government actually runs.
Exactly. Suddenly, those stories about states fighting over pollution or healthcare start to click.
And it's not just about understanding.
Right.
It's about doing something.
Right. When you get how these decisions are made at the state and local level, you can actually get involved and make your voice heard.
So this isn't just a deep dive into law books. It's a deep dive into being a good citizen.
Absolutely. And while we've talked a lot about the limits on states, about what they can't do, let's not forget the awesome things they can do.
Oh, good point. We've talked about constraints, but what about the cool stuff?
States are often called laboratories of democracy, and for good reason. They've got the power to try out new things, experiment with policies, and find solutions that fit their communities.
So even with the feds setting some ground rules, states can still be creative and responsive to their people.
You bet. And that's where things get really interesting. When states take the lead on big issues like climate change, healthcare, or making the justice system fairer, they can start a wave that spreads across the whole country.
So state action isn't just about following orders from Washington. It's about leading the way and showing what's possible.
Exactly. And here's one last question to leave our listeners with. In a world that's constantly changing, with technology connecting everything and problems that cross borders, how do we update this idea of power sharing for the 21st century?
Ooh, that's a big one. Are we talking about things like cybersecurity, data privacy, artificial intelligence, stuff that doesn't fit neatly into our old ideas of what's a state issue and what's a federal issue?
That's the challenge. These new issues are making us rethink what federalism means in a super complex world.
It's like our whole conversation about state and local power is now playing out on a global scale.
It is, and there's no easy answer. It takes serious thinking, open conversations, and being willing to change how we do things to meet these new challenges.
That's a fantastic point to wrap up on. A challenge for our listeners to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep working to make our democracy even better.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, deep divers, we've come to the end of our journey exploring state and local power in the U.S. We hope you've discovered something new about how this complex system works, about the challenges it faces, and the incredible potential it holds. Until next time, keep diving deep into the issues that matter to you.